We're from Massachusetts, so we get excited about this, and I can't remember a time I didn't know about Johnny Appleseed. If you drive west on Route 2 from the Boston area towards Western Mass, when you reach the town of Leominster, you'll see a big billboard over the highway that welcomes you to the town that is home to both Johnny Appleseed and the pink plastic lawn flamingo. They happened at different times. Also, if you get off the highway at Leominster, it's called the Johnny Appleseed Visitor Center. There's a statue of Johnny, and there is a gigantic fiberglass apple that you can, if you wish, pose with. Truly, everyone gets excited about apples around here. And rightly so, too. Apples are great. But particularly this guy got excited about apples, and lots of people get excited about him, for reasons that I am still exploring here in this video. This is just context, but he looked friendly in all the art I have seen of him, and he was famous for one thing, planting trees, rather than killing people or hunting animals, which are the two things that American heroes otherwise tend to be famous for. So that was refreshing. I know exactly where I would have first heard of him. My mom is a keen historian. Hi, Mom. And I learned about John Chapman from her, including his real name. I was pretty sure Appleseed was a nickname even when I was a very small child. I didn't think nominative determinism worked like that. Everywhere you'll see the image of a long, thin old man striding along, throwing apple seeds like he's sowing wheat in a field. It never occurred to me till recently to wonder where he was getting all of those seeds or why he would fling them around like that in all the depictions. It doesn't seem like just flinging apple seeds straight on the ground would work as a sowing technique. Spoiler, it wouldn't. I'll get into that in a sec. There are not only movies and television shows about this guy, there are poems and songs about him. One that I believe that my mom learned in Girl Scouts is, "The Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord for giving me the things I need, the sun and the rain and the apple seed. The Lord is good to me." I heard that as Johnny Appleseed's grace. And he seems like people consider him as some sort of wandering holy man. He seems like a prophet to Americans. I'm not sure of what. Maybe we'll find out in this video. So this is going to be an attempt to find out why I care deeply about Johnny Appleseed and explore why other people do as well. And I'll try to stick to a just the facts overview of his life and times, and then talk a little bit about how other people see him. It is really difficult to give a just the facts rendition of his life because there aren't an awful lot of facts to go on. He left nearly no writings, and all of the descriptions of him are almost without exception coming from people who wrote memoirs that involved him after he was long dead, because he was a part of their childhoods. Nearly everything I'm going to say in this video comes from one book, Johnny Appleseed and the American Orchard by William Kerrigan. This has been a tremendous resource to me, and I've gotten a lot out of it. And this is a very hard-headed book, and it cites its sources carefully. And even this book has to rely on a lot of hearsay and memoirs written decades after the stuff in them happened, and anecdotes and tall tales that were probably not trustworthy or based on any reality. A lot of people just sort of accepted John Chapman as a part of normal life when they were younger, and when they were older they realized, oh yeah, he was definitely part of a world that isn't there anymore, and included him in their memoirs. A lot of people just remembered him after he died because he was weird. Really weird even for his time and place, usually in a charming way. Even for the Western frontier in the 18 single digits to 30s. Which had its share of weirdos anyway. So he came from Massachusetts, and we love to claim him as a local, as I've said. But he only spent the first few years of his life in Leominster, and then lived in Western Mass till his teens. When he was a little boy, his mother died of tuberculosis, and his father was in the Revolutionary Army and couldn't come back to take charge of the family, so he and his siblings were probably brought up by their grandparents. So John's dad was named Nathaniel. As the war went on, he got assigned to the Springfield Arsenal in western Massachusetts on the Connecticut River. This is near where I grew up, so it's all very familiar to me. And it's about 90 miles from where the three existing kids were growing up in Leominster, so it was a significant journey in those days because you didn't have highways or cars, so you wouldn't want to do that on the regular. For a long time, they didn't see a lot of each other. But eventually, Nathaniel Chapman married a local girl named Lucy Cooley. I say girl advisedly, she was 18. And they settled down in Longmeadow, Mass. And now Nathaniel's got a wife, he's got a home he can bring his kids to, so the three existing kids move out and join them in Longmeadow, and Nathaniel and Lucy have 10 more kids. John Chapman spends the rest of his childhood there. So Longmeadow, then as now a small, quiet town in western Mass, arranged around a long common, which is the long meadow that gives it its name, and right near the Connecticut River, so John would presumably have learned how to canoe before he was a grown-up. Also, something that made Longmeadow unusual is that their minister was Reverend Stephen Williams. He's notable for having been carried off captive to Canada with a lot of his family in the raid on Old Deerfield, decades before when he was a little boy. And his sister was Eunice Williams, who was also one of the child captives and eventually assimilated among the Mohawks, but that is a story we may get into another time. In any case, John wouldn't have met her, the timelines don't line up, but he would for sure have known about her and about the Reverend's odd experiences in childhood when he was growing up. Lucy Cooley came into the marriage with a piece of land right in the middle of Longmeadow, and that's where the family is now farming. And even when it goes well, 13 kids can't exactly have the same inheritance from one piece of land because dividing it up between 13 people wouldn't make sense. Some of them are going to have to find something else to do, at a minimum. Some of them just marry and move elsewhere. John's eldest sister, Elizabeth, marries and moves back to Leominster. By the time John was 16 years old, he was no longer living in his parents' house. The next thing we hear of him for sure, and this is as for sure as anything you can get about John Chapman, by which I mean there were anecdotes later when people were writing their memoirs or giving talks on local history decades on. What probably happened is that around 1796 to 1797, he crossed the Allegheny Mountains alone, barefoot, in November, into the teeth of a snowstorm, and survived. On the way, supposedly, he had to make improvised snowshoes by cutting down saplings and twisting them into the shape of snowshoes and tying them to his feet with strips of blanket and forging on over the snow. He was carrying a rifle and a tomahawk and a big sack of apple seeds. He made it out of the mountains and as far west as Broken Straw Creek, and that was where he started planting apple tree nurseries. We know that whole anecdote because a local historian, Judge Lansing Wetmore, gave a series of talks on local history in 1853. And he enthused about John Chapman's being one of the first few white people in the area that became Warren, Pennsylvania. Wetmore didn't have the whole picture. He was completely unaware of the nickname Johnny Appleseed, probably because that didn't exist yet at the time that John Chapman passed through the area. One of the things that makes me trust some of the anecdotes more than others is that they sound like they're coming from people who couldn't possibly have squared up their stories with the later ones, or they'd have started adding in details that they hadn't known at the time. So the fan base hadn't yet gotten together and squared up all the details in all their anecdotes to make them sound consistent, which makes me trust this one more. But a lot of what I'm going to say is based on similar stories that people told about how they knew Chapman when they were kids and what he used to do and say, and some of them sound like they've been reading each other's memoirs. So take everything with a grain of salt here, is all I'm saying. The town of Warren didn't really exist yet at the time Chapman went there. There was one log cabin where the agent of a land company was living. And get this, it was built on the site of an abandoned Indian village. Why was it abandoned? I wonder. For context, the Seneca are a Native American people. They're part of the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy in what's now the northeastern United States. The land in Pennsylvania where Chapman started planting apple tree nurseries had recently been stolen from the Seneca. In a quick, violent 1-2 punch, first a war and then a land grab. Remember, at this point, there'd just been a revolution. In that revolution, the Seneca fought for the British. In 1779, General Washington sent troops into Seneca lands in a punishment raid to burn their homes, drive them out, and make their land uninhabitable so they could never return there. One armed force marched through Pennsylvania and another through western New York. They wrecked and burned homes, they destroyed crops of corn, and they chopped down and girdled apple and peach tree orchards. If that sounds off base from your mental image of what a native village would have, well, it was a surprise to the American soldiers who were burning and wrecking the place as well. The white stereotype of Native America is hunting and fishing, hunting and fishing, hunting and fishing, and maybe some mental images of women farming corn, squash, and beans if my imagination is really feeling up to the task. Only when I was reading up for this video did I learn that the Seneca had been maintaining apple and peach orchards for decades before the Revolution. Not only this, but in general, peaches, not a New World fruit, but they were brought to what's now the US in the 1500s, and indigenous Americans had been successfully maintaining peach orchards all through what's now the South and as far north as Pennsylvania and New York. Since the 1500s. It was super common. The fact that this is coming to me as a revelation makes me angry that this part of history was kept from me. And it's also hitting me, and not for the first time. It's super easy to forget history when it makes us even a little bit uncomfortable. Please keep in mind that any time this narrative makes it sound like Chapman is traveling into the deepest wilderness where the hand of man has never set foot, there are already people there. There are already people there, but the dominant narrative doesn't want to admit they're there. William Kerrigan's book points out that when Chapman was traveling through the Allegheny Mountains, there would have been native trails. He would have been able to stay in native trail shelters. They were still out there and still maintained from time to time. When Chapman started growing his orchards in Pennsylvania, the nearest village to where he was living when he started was Burnt House. There were about 400 Seneca people there, and they were led by Cornplanter, who was a war chief who had helped to rebuild the village after it was burnt out too during the Revolution by the Americans. They even had a sawmill there, though it's not clear whether Cornplanter had tried to get the orchard started again. One of the ways that we know what Chapman was up to and approximately where he was for the next few years is store ledgers. When he shopped somewhere, there'd be his name in the ledger and a list of what he'd bought. So some of the mythology around Johnny Appleseed has him as a vegetarian and a gentleman who would never fire a gun. However, we have his store receipts, and at least when he was a young adult, they included things like brandy, whiskey, tobacco, pork, chocolate, sugar, gunpowder, and moccasins. So pretty normal stuff to have and need on the frontier. Here's a quick and dirty look at the Pennsylvania Land Act of 1792. The state wants money from rich land speculators. The state also wants the physical presence of white farmers in order to till the soil, grow crops, and bluntly to fill the country with white people and keep the Indians who have been displaced permanently displaced so that they can never come back or gather force to become hostile ever again. So the state lets a lot of individual settlers buy land in about 400-acre tracts. You would have had to be a pretty wealthy individual to buy a tract that size. And then there's land companies. Land investors get together and buy tremendous amounts of land. But in order to maintain the right to that land, you had to improve it. Cut down trees, level the ground, plow the ground, make gardens, build houses that were actually weatherproof, the lot. So the land investors were hoping to recruit poorer farmers who couldn't have invested on their own to move out there and essentially be their tenants or their vassals. Farm the land, improve it, and be present in order to make sure that everybody could see that it was occupied and being worked on. For the first few years, it's really hard to get anybody to move to that area and try to live in it and make settlements and improvements, because the Northwest Indian War happens right then. Potential new tenant farmers don't want to move to the area for fear they will be killed. Quite reasonably. So none of the big investors can make settlement and improvement happen on the timetable they initially agreed to. There are lawyers out there telling individuals that if you just move to the area and start making settlements and improvements, build a house, farm the land, then it will belong to you in the eyes of the law because that's totally what the law says, and I'll totally be there to help you fight it in court if you have to. So, where does John Chapman fit into all this? Being marginal and growing plants on other people's property, or possibly it's not anybody's property, maybe it belongs to the state, maybe nobody's got a title to it, I don't know, the matter's in court. There are a lot of images of John Chapman striding merrily along, flinging handfuls of seed on the ground at random wherever he went, as if he was a farmer in a plowed field sowing corn. I am pretty certain he didn't ever do that. His technique goes like this: he'll find an area that no one's going to look too hard at. Low-lying land near a body of water, like where there's a floodplain area that only floods occasionally, or an island in a river is even better. If it's somewhere that deer can get to it, he needs to fence it off. As soon as he could grow an apple seedling big enough to dig up and sell, but not too big to successfully transplant, he could get between a penny and 6 pence for it. He was surrounded by farmers who were highly motivated to put things in the ground. So customers and a business opportunity. It takes upwards of 7 years for an apple seedling to get big enough to start growing apples itself, but remember, the people buying these not only want to farm, they want to be seen to be farming. He would plant a bunch of seeds in one location, travel on to another one miles away, plant a bunch of seeds there, rinse and repeat until he ran out of seeds, and at some point the first one would have young sprouts that he would have to go back and check on at some point. Usually he would try and at least fence them off a little bit, but it's really hard to make a deer-proof fence, and deer would get in and eat some of them. Sometimes the land that they were on would just flood and he'd lose them like that, and some of the seeds wouldn't germinate, so there was a high loss rate. But even so, he was just sowing a lot of seeds, and if even some came up, that was a good return on his efforts. And now you get a quick and dirty overview on how apple trees work. If you want to have an apple tree, you have two options. One of them is plant apple seeds and see what you get. The other option is to take a root from one kind of apple tree, it doesn't matter any kind as long as it's got a healthy root, and graft a sprout from a different kind of apple tree that has the kind of apples you enjoy. Graft them together, and the sprout, if you've done it right, will heal onto the root, and the whole thing will become a new tree, and it will grow the kind of apples that you know you enjoy. That sounds like an insane amount of effort, from my younger perspective. Why would you go to all the trouble of creating a Frankenstein-together tree, when you could just plant a seed and have it sprout, and it grows naturally, and you don't have to worry if the join between them has healed in place? Well, turns out there's an answer, and the answer is consistency. Apple trees, when they grow from seed, are extremely unlikely to have the kind of apples, when they're grown up, that they grew from. Genetic diversity being what it is. If you plant an apple seed, you could get anything. Every time you plant an apple seed, if it lives to become a sapling and then have fruit itself, it's a random chance what you'll get. The fruit could turn out to be little and bitter and hard, it could be sour, it could be big and incredibly sweet, or any combination of colors or flavors or textures in between those. Whereas by grafting, you can be absolutely sure of getting the same kind of fruit over and over again. If you have ever eaten an apple that you bought in a store, that came from a grafted tree. I guarantee it, across the board. Growers and commercial sellers of apples want to know what kind of apple they're buying and then reselling to customers. That's where named varieties of apple come from. Ever had a Honeycrisp? Golden Delicious? They have very distinct flavors and textures, right? Well, if you took the seeds from either of them and planted them and they grew a tree, they wouldn't produce Honeycrisps and Golden Deliciouses, they'd produce whatever. You wouldn't know till you tried. John Chapman is doing this on purpose. Note his nickname is Johnny Appleseed, not Johnny Appletree. He never grafted, he only grew from seed. The nice thing is, there's no overhead. Back in Pennsylvania, and points east at least, there are cider mills where he can just go and pick up apple seeds for free, because after they grind and juice the apples, the leftover is a lot of apple pulp and flesh squeezed dry of most of its juice and full of seeds, and anybody who is enterprising and doesn't mind groping through a lot of smelly apple glop can just fill bags with seeds outside a cider mill as much as he wants, and Johnny Chapman did want. The author of Johnny Appleseed and the American Orchard makes the point that the smell of rotting apples would have followed John wherever he went. So I still haven't explained to myself, what's the point of growing tremendous orchards full of apple trees that will produce wildly inconsistent types of apple in order to sell the seedlings to customers? Well, the business model is that the farmers who plant these trees are going to make cider out of the apples. Making cider is something where the more types of apple you have, the better it'll be. This is great. Small, sour, gnarly apples, big, juicy apples, anything in between. As the song says, cider is better the more types one has. Back in the day, cider meant hard cider. They didn't have the distinction where saying cider meant the sweet juice and you had to specify if it had alcoholic content. The farmers on the frontier want to be in a position to make cider as soon as they can. It has often been suggested that beer and cider were widely drunk throughout history because the water wasn't safe. That is a whole can of worms that I'm not going to get into right here. But whether people in history did this because the water wasn't safe to drink, or whether they enjoyed the buzz, or whether they liked the taste, or whether it was a part of their diet and they needed to get some of their calories from beer and cider, they sure did drink an awful lot. In fact, everybody was consuming at least some beer or cider, even children, regularly. It didn't need to be very strong. I have made some cider at home using techniques that would not be too different than farm techniques in the frontier in the 1800s, and it came out with about a 3.2 alcoholic content, which is not strong at all. But then again, it would be unpredictable because everyone in a farming community is brewing their own cider for themselves. Chapman seems to have made friends easily all his life, despite, being visibly a weirdo for a lot of it. He was also disconnected from other people in a way that's confusing and open to interpretation. One of the anecdotes about him from this time that got my attention is that the onlooker saw some guy get mad at John Chapman for some stupid reason, yell at him, berate him, call him names, and then outright kick him. And John Chapman just stood there and didn't hit back or appear to become angry at all. The onlooker said he was totally unruffled and saw this as saintly patience, like Christ-like behavior and turning the other cheek. You could also see it as freezing up in response to aggression or just pure confusion at the ways people were acting. One of the contradictions about Chapman that I find very appealing is that, in general, he really seems to like people and enjoy their company, apart from, the kicking guy. But also, he seems to have really enjoyed alone time outdoors and shaped the rest of his life in order to have as much alone time outdoors as possible. So he spent his 20s in Pennsylvania and traveling back and forth between there and Ohio, mostly on foot, sometimes riding, sometimes in a canoe when that was convenient. Eventually he formed a strategy of reaching into Ohio to plant orchards, go back to Pennsylvania to check on how things were doing there, traveling back east to gather seeds from cider mills and refill his seed sources, and then rinse and repeat the entire cycle again. In the first few years of the 1800s, not only John was living in the area, his entire extended family moved out to Ohio and settled there. With the exception of his married sister who stayed in Massachusetts, the entire family moved to an area now known as Marietta, Ohio, on something called the Donation Lands, near extended family who'd been out there for years. Oh hey, remember how the part of Pennsylvania John was initially living in had previously been subject to ethnic cleansing of the Seneca by Washington's army in the Revolution? Well, here we are in Ohio, and there was just an Indian war out here too. Back about 15 years earlier, white settlers had started building homes on the lands of the Delaware and Wendat peoples, who objected to this and eventually killed 12 settlers. The shareholders who had bought the land responded to this by putting out a call for Warlike Christian men, that's a direct quote. They wanted white farmers to go to the area and essentially farm the land with one hand while holding a gun with the other, as it were. You've heard this before. The young United States is consolidating power and destroying native culture by pouring white farmers into an area to fill it up so that the native population is surrounded and cannot gather power ever again. Anyway, the Chapmans didn't have money for land parcels, and they aren't in the warlike Christians category so much as the Christians too poor to afford their own farm. They're likely either squatting or living on the lands of family members who had gone out there earlier in the first rush. For most of the Chapmans, this was the one big journey they would ever make in their lives, and they stayed around the area for the rest of their lives, and their children after them lived there too. Traveling a distance that far was extremely unusual for people in that day and age. John Chapman being as mobile as he was made him extremely unusual even for his time. Moving was also a really dicey proposition as an old person because you could not be certain you would be able to have time to get settled in the new place before you died of old age. And sadly, that was what happened to John's father. Within the first couple of years that the family was getting settled in the area, he passed away. And it would have been a grueling moving expense for the whole family because, unlike John Chapman most of his life, the rest of the family cared about having clothes and regular meals and a roof over their heads. John kept traveling. He would stop by and see family members occasionally, but he never stopped moving for long. On foot or on rivers in a canoe, or sometimes on the Ohio River he'd use 2 canoes lashed together to form sort of a catamaran to transport his stuff, including those seeds that he was going back east, going to cider mills, digging out as many seeds as he could possibly carry, taking them back west and creating new nurseries, always pushing west with the frontier with those nurseries. He was in the Licking Valley of Ohio as early as 1801. At that point, he had a pack horse with saddlebags full of seeds. In 1806, he was in Mount Vernon, Ohio, selling apple trees to new settlers in an area called Owl Creek. So, presumably he'd been out there before that because you couldn't transport seedling apple trees too far without killing them, so he must have already been out to the area and sneakily made a tree nursery that he could sell the trees from. And we know that he was out there because that was when he voted in the first county election. In 1809, he bought land for the first time at age 35. It was 2 town lots near Owl Creek. That sounds like it was meant for building a home in the center of what was going to be a new town. He never actually lived or built houses on the land. Likely he was buying it in order to protect his right to a pre-existing apple nursery he'd made on the banks of the creek already. Like I said, he's planting his tree nurseries in areas where he foresees there being a rush of settlers who are going to be hungry to start farming soon. Also in 1809, there was a big public dinner in celebration of marking out the town of Marietta, Ohio, and he was part of a big public meal that they held in the soon-to-be town square. He's still consistently barefoot and dressed in rags, and that's still weird but not hugely unusual. He's on the frontier. People out here tend to look poorer even if they aren't poorer. People tend to have lower standards of dress, and going barefoot is fairly normal. After all, you can't just go to the store and buy a new pair of sneakers anytime that you want. You gotta conserve your good shoes, and also, shoes don't heal but feet do. So putting wear on your bare feet makes more sense than putting wear on your shoes if you know you're going to need your shoes to be good further down the line. John Chapman had such a thick layer of callus on his feet that in later life, as a trick to amuse little kids, he used to take a pin and shove it into the sole of his foot and not react at all because he couldn't feel a thing because it wasn't going anywhere near his living flesh. The callus was just that thick and tough. One of the points that I brought up earlier is of John Chapman as being a universal friend to everybody, including the Native Americans around him. Sorry to report, there aren't really any anecdotes that bear that out. All of the anecdotes that involve him and Native people are hostile to neutral sounding. There isn't an obvious go-to for a Native person who liked him and got on well with him. And I say that in tones of disappointment because I was really hoping that there would be something, because I am deeply invested in John Chapman being one of the good white people. Over the next few years, things changed between native and settler populations in the US in general and in Ohio in particular. One was that even more white settlers poured into north and central Ohio and farmed there. So the natives who lived there were effectively surrounded. Another was Tecumseh's Confederacy. He was a chief of the Shawnee who united the native people in the Great Lakes region into an alliance to resist the encroachment of the United States into their lands. This is sometimes called Tecumseh's War, and it's also part of the War of 1812, and I do not remotely have the space here to get into Tecumseh and his life and death, or to do any of the situation justice. Just keep in mind that everybody native in Ohio, whether they were part of the native resistance movement or not, would have been living up against a lot of hostile, heavily armed white people. There was a point in 1812 in Mansfield, Ohio, when natives shot and scalped a white merchant near one of John Chapman's tree nurseries. The local non-combatant white people were crowded into blockhouses at this point, fearful of a mass native raid. The local militia were largely unavailable because they were overextended. And why were they overextended, you may ask? Well, they were guarding the imprisoned entire population of a local native village, whom the militia had preemptively evicted from their homes, taken prisoner, and then burned their homes and entire village, in case the people of this village might go over to Tecumseh. I don't know about you, but the words self-fulfilling prophecy are floating through my head. Anyway, as the white population of Mansfield is panicking at the thought of there being a native rising against them, they call for a volunteer to head 30 miles away to Mount Vernon, the nearest place where they know there's US militia, and call for help and reinforcements and warn them what's happening. John Chapman volunteers to go. He sped off through the night. The first time this story makes it into print, he's on a horse. Every other rendition of this anecdote, he's on foot. For sure, it would have made sense for him to go because he traveled the area regularly alone and knew the way, and would have been comfortable moving through the woods at night. So he gets to Mount Vernon safely, rouses the population from their homes and beds by bellowing, "Flee for your lives! The British and Indians are coming upon you, and destruction followeth in their footsteps." Somehow by this he convinced Mount Vernon to send troops and guns to Mansfield and went back there himself. And then it turns out there is no raid coming. Everybody panicked. The British haven't actually invaded central Ohio at all, and the murdered man was an isolated incident. Eventually, the Mansfieldians came out of their blockhouses and went about their business. Later still, there's a raid of reprisal by natives who kill some of the white people who were responsible for evicting them from their homes. Every detail in the story gets flattened out in the retellings except for the thing where John Chapman was amazingly cool and brave and covered a huge distance on foot at night alone to spread the alarm like Paul Revere. So he's a gentle and unworldly soul, but he'll also leap in to enable warfare, and when the chips are down, he's with the US against the British, and he's with the other white people against the natives. Somewhere in the 18-teens, he got religion in a big way. He would presumably already have been a Christian because that was just how he grew up and what everybody did where he came from, but this was something special. He gets a hold of the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg and becomes devoted to them. Swedenborg was a Swedish nobleman from the previous century who had visions of angels and traveling to heaven and hell, and wrote 16 books about his experiences doing this and his complex views of spirituality and the afterlife. Small groups of enthusiasts got together and formed reading circles to enjoy and discuss his work together, republished it, translated it into English. Eventually from this came a group called the Church of the New Jerusalem. They're still out there. There's a Church of the New Jerusalem in Boston. And they sent missionaries into places like the American frontier in order to recruit more people to their movement. Johnny probably wasn't recruited by a missionary. He was probably recruited by finding a Swedenborg book and liking it. One of the early enthusiasts for Swedenborg was a merchant in Philadelphia named William Schlatter, who got so excited about these books that he would stick copies of books and pamphlets by Swedenborg into bolts of cloth that he was shipping to sell to people around the US, and they would arrive in the stores and the books would fall out of them and people would pick them up and ideally read them and be convinced. We know John Chapman could read, which is not always a given. He's on store ledgers, as early as the 1790s, buying 2 small history books in one case, so we know he liked to read. By 1817, Chapman was sending away directly to William Schlatter to buy more books by Swedenborg, but by that point he was a repeat customer and already knew what the movement was about. Also in 1817, due to Chapman's activities, the Swedenborg fan base in England gets an item for their annual newsletter. It begins, "There is in the Western country a very extraordinary missionary of the New Jerusalem. A man has appeared who seems to be almost independent of corporal wants and sufferings. He goes barefooted, can sleep anywhere, in-house or out of house, and live upon the coarsest and most scanty fare. He has actually thawed the ice with his bare feet." In tones of awe, they describe Chapman, though they don't give his name. And they describe him as traveling into remote settlements to pass out the works of Swedenborg and spend his apple nursery money on reprinting them. John would evangelize for the Church of the New Jerusalem for the rest of his life. He became famous, infamous, for being a pain in the neck about it. At one point, someone who knew he liked to read religious studies gave him a Universalist book, and he read it and was disgusted by it and threw it down and turned his back on it. At another point, the hosts he was staying with got so bored at hearing him discourse about Swedenborg that they said he should go and tell the cook at the local tavern about Swedenborg and convert her. And Chapman took this seriously and he tried it. He followed the cook around throughout the day, throughout her chores, discoursing on religious theory to her until she got so sick of him she chased him out with a stick. What was he actually asserting here? Swedenborg had a lot of unusual ideas about the afterlife. He believed that you can make personal spiritual progress after death, in the afterlife, become a better person, become a worse person. He believed that people can intentionally choose to go to hell or to heaven, that there are different layers of heaven, that some people might want to stay at the basic entry level forever, and some people would want to advance further and further into the mysteries of God. He also believed that you can go on being married in heaven, or that your earthly spouse and your heavenly spouse might be 2 different people. And again, if you had never married on earth, it might be possible that you have a heavenly spouse who you will meet when you get there. Your soulmate, in effect. Swedenborg spent a lot of his life in love with a married woman who could never be with him, so it's easy to see this as wish fulfillment for him. John never married. With what I've been saying, it's easy to see why, but that was a cheap shot. Let me go into the reasons. One of the main sources we have on John is from an author named Rosella Rice, who knew John personally when she was a little girl and he used to visit her family, spent a lot of time around him as a kid, and decades later wrote about him. She had heard that he had had his heart broken and could never love again. There are a lot of stories like that in general about people who, for whatever reason, never married. People seem to want an explanation when an adult doesn't marry. Now, to me, that doesn't need a complex explanation. Maybe he didn't want to get married. Maybe he did, but the opportunity never arose. It doesn't have to be that deep. For sure, when John was a young man, he was living on the frontier in an area where there were not a lot of eligible women. And he didn't have a home to bring a wife back to, so he couldn't exactly go back east and find a woman to court and marry and bring to his home. He didn't have a home. And then as he got older and the frontier changed and there were more grown women around, he looked poor and visibly eccentric. Even if he wasn't poor, he was apt to go about leading a marginal lifestyle, sleeping in the woods and not have a house of his own. That would not have made him a great marriage prospect. He did get along well with women. A detail that I think is important here is that he spent a lot of his life boarding at other people's houses for short times, and the women of a house usually seemed happy to see him coming up the walk and enjoyed talking with him. But that doesn't mean that they saw him as a marriage prospect either for themselves or for their daughters. In the attempts by third parties to explain why he never married, there are stories about this being a part of John's religion. I don't completely buy that it was connected with his being a follower of Swedenborg. There's a whole set of stories that assert that John thought that, like Emanuel Swedenborg, he would have a marriage in heaven, although one had been denied to him on earth. Or that he would earn a wife in heaven by leading a chaste and deprived life in this world. Or that he would have 2 wives in heaven because he'd been so very good in this life. I find it hard to believe that anybody who was a follower of Swedenborg even would seriously assert that. We just have anecdotes about it. I don't buy that this was coming from Chapman himself, if you see what I mean. I think it was a rumor that people spread about him that he addressed in his own life. The anecdote where this comes up is that 2 boys asked him, "When you get to the afterlife, are you going to sleep with both your wives there?" Supposedly Chapman answered, "Yes, my 2 wives will sleep in a bed, and I intend to have a wide board planed smooth and nice attached to the side of the bed for me to sleep on." We don't know if he said any of that, and if he did, we don't know how much of it was a joke. Remember, it's easy to not give historical characters credit for having a sense of humor. There's a set of other stories that are just creepy. John himself supposedly said that at some point in the past, he had decided to pick a little girl who would grow up to be perfect and wonderful, and he would visit her to check that she was growing up perfect and wonderful, and then when she was of age, he would marry her and she would be the perfect wife. And that at some point, he checked in on her and he saw her kissing a little boy her own age, and was so disgusted and disappointed that he swore off matrimony forever. No one who recounted this anecdote seems to have really remarked much on how it's horrifying. Even if he didn't ever have a plan to bring up his own wife to marry him, there's another story that is kind of a similar shape, and this one involves him staying with a man named Melzar Tannehill. Supposedly, he once asked to marry Melzar's young daughter when she came of age. Melzar lied and said she was already taken. So, even in the time period, some people had the sense to find it disturbing that a grown man wanted to raise a girl to marry him when she grew up. Also, even if Melzar had been inclined to betroth his young daughter to a grown-up who she would have to marry in the future, Chapman would not have looked like a visibly good prospect for matrimony. As I said, poor, ragged, notably eccentric, and belongs to a fringe religious group that he's a missionary for, self-appointed. John made a great missionary in one way. He was supremely at ease about everything that he chose to do. He might not be making a lot of converts, but he could confidently expound to anybody. Much like friend of the show Bronson Alcott. He dressed oddly, he had unusual religious ideas, he was focused on apples, and he was completely immune to embarrassment. Speaking of immunity to embarrassment, let's talk a bit about John's outfits. Like I said, he went barefoot almost all the time. There are tons of accounts of him going around in rags or nearly naked. The details of the rags change. Sometimes he's wearing an old coffee sack with neck holes and armholes instead of a shirt. Sometimes he's in ill-fitting cast-offs that he's just wearing until they fall apart thread from thread. Sometimes he's in a bathrobe-like coat that he got the mom of one of his hosts to sew for him. When he was an old man in the 1840s, his niece sewed him a shirt that she made out of pieces of feed sack with printing stamped on them. And he loved this shirt and wore it till it fell apart. You could do that back in the early 1800s without exciting a lot of remark on the frontier. You couldn't do that in the 1840s without people staring at you. He lived long enough to be seen as someone from the old days. Of course, the elephant in the room here is that he is famous for wearing a tin pot on his head as a hat. That feels uncomfortable. But frankly, a lot of things about his lifestyle sound like they'd be uncomfortable to me. There is a story that he used to wear layers on his head. A hat, then the tin pot on top of that, then a layer of Emanuel Swedenborg's books and tracts, and then a third hat over that to keep the tracts dry. He also had a military hat at one point that he wore for a while, and he had a homemade cap at another point that had a big pasteboard visor sticking out of just the front to shade his face like a baseball cap. Like I said, totally invulnerable to embarrassment or self-consciousness. He also ate just whatever he had handy, in a way that I find incredibly disturbing. There's a story about him picking bread out of somebody else's pig slop pail and eating the bread. There's another story that at one point he hired a guy to help him clear land. Part of the deal was that he had to give the guy his meals. So far, so good. So they work on the land. Lunchtime rolls around. John Chapman pulls out a handful of walnuts and gives them to the guy, and then he pulls out more walnuts and starts eating them himself, and the guy realizes that this is what is for lunch, nothing else. And he walks off the job. There's another story that at one point in the winter, John Chapman had a lot of butternuts, and he just ate butternuts continuously and nothing else until they were all gone. There are stories about Chapman being a vegetarian. Some Swedenborgians were. We don't know if Johnny was, but we do know that he would just eat anything, and sometimes that was straight butternuts for weeks. There's also at least one story that one night John was sleeping in the open and he had a campfire going because it was cold, and he noticed mosquitoes were flying into the flames and burning up. And he felt so bad at that he put out the campfire and slept in the cold rather than kill mosquitoes. It could have happened, but it also sounds so universal that I don't quite buy it. It seems like it could happen in nearly any culture, if you see what I mean. The wandering holy man was so virtuous and had such a big heart that he could not bear to kill so much as a mosquito. John lived to be 71, and up until near the end of his life he was continuously traveling back and forth between tree nurseries as he had done for decades. He was spending a lot of his time around Fort Wayne, Indiana by this point, traveling back and forth between there and Ohio, where his family were still living. A lot of his siblings had kids by this point. The terrain had changed to the extent that he was traveling back and forth in areas that used to be tiny footpaths or dirt roads back in his early days, and now there were paved roads. In some places there were canals and canal boats. The cities had factories. There were regular stagecoach routes through a lot of the area where he used to and still went on foot. He was also extremely careful with his money right up until the end of his life, so if he could walk, he walked. And in 1845 he died. He was boarding in a private home at that point, and the undertaker who laid him out recorded him as having clothes on consisting of the backsides of 4 different pairs of pants with the waistband still attached, all tied round his waist, forming sort of a skirt of aprons, underneath another even more tattered pair of pants, and a burlap sack with a hole for his head to go through and 2 holes for his arms, as his coat. So he looked destitute. In fact, he'd done reasonably well for himself financially. He owned a lot of land. He had enough money coming in that when he wanted to make a new apple nursery, he could lease the land officially instead of squatting and having to risk getting kicked off it. And he gave to charity. So he was helping care for the actual poor, even though he looked poor himself. After his death, it took 10 years to settle his estate, and a lot of that was due to the debts he'd never called in or never gotten around to calling in when he died, and the debts that nobody had managed to call in from him when he had passed away. And his sister and brother-in-law were living on a piece of land that he technically owned and had leased to them. They claimed against the estate for money for making improvements to that land. A lot of the claims that were made on the estate had to be paid out, and in the event, most of his earthly fortune got taken up in these claims. So it pretty much broke even by the time that the court case was settled for his estate. And now I would like to read you a couple of excerpts from a poem by Lydia Maria Child. This is from the poem Appleseed John. Poor Johnny was bended well nigh double, with years of toil and care and trouble, but his large old heart still felt the need of doing for others some kindly deed. But what can I do? Old Johnny said, I who work so hard for daily bread. It takes heaps of money to do much good. I am far too poor to do as I would. He worked and he worked with might and main, but no one knew the plan in his brain. He took ripe apples in pay for chores and carefully cut from them all the cores. He filled a bagful, then wandered away, and no man saw him for many a day. With knapsack over his shoulder slung, he marched along and whistled or sung. He seemed to roam with no object in view, like one who had nothing on earth to do. But journeying thus o'er the prairies wide, he paused now and then, and his bag untied. With pointed cane deep holes he would bore, and in every hole he placed a core, then covered them well and left them there, in keeping of sunshine, rain, and air. It goes on. It describes him as planting the trees for the benefit of future generations. So he kept on traveling far and wide till his old limbs failed him and he died. He said at the last, "'Tis a comfort to feel I've done good in the world, though not a good deal." Weary travelers journeying west in the shade of his trees find pleasant rest, and they often start with glad surprise at the rosy fruit that round them lies. And if they inquire whence came such trees, where not a bough once swayed in the breeze, the answer still comes as they travel on, these trees were planted by Appleseed John. So, for this video I haven't done a lot of revisiting of the pop culture around Johnny Appleseed in TV or film, but I have read some poems or revisited some poems that were written by authors after the death of John Chapman. And it's amazing how moving I find that poem, and it's amazing how she gets nearly everything about it wrong. He did sure spend a lot of time outside and alone. That's in line with the facts. But also, we have this image that has come down to us that leaves out everything except the apple trees that grew from seeds. In pop culture, the existence of the cider to be made from these apples disappears. The fact that it's hard cider and not sweet cider disappears. The part where this was his job and he was selling these trees for money because this was how he lived disappears. And the part where he has to follow the frontier, which itself follows every anti-native war, disappears. He's just seen as a benevolent spirit of the frontier, spirit of the wilderness. You'll notice that in the wilderness that the poet was just describing, not only were there no apple trees, there were no trees at all in her mental image, and he's bringing trees to an area where there were none, and he's bringing fruit to an area that had no apples. Just out of the goodness of his heart. For no particular reason, just, as his personal charity. And I think that's beautiful, and it's also pretty much completely disconnected from the real person. So I can see why people get excited about the fictionalized version of this guy. He seems like a saint of planting apple trees, just out of benevolence towards future generations so we could have some nice fruit to eat, and who doesn't love an apple? I love them, they're delicious. So, having gotten to know the actual person, I'm also making up my mind, how do I feel about John Chapman, the real person? If you can get to know a real person by exploring their largely undocumented and unrecorded life, and when you don't really have their writings, you can still get to know somebody a little bit, as well as you can get to know anyone you haven't met yourself. He seems like somebody who had an impulse to do things in an unconventional way, followed up that impulse, and himself was just harmlessly weird in a way that I mostly find charming and appealing. I love a weirdo. And I love a wandering holy fool. The end result of all of those anecdotes about his life is to make me see the people around him, see him as a little bit funny, a little bit tragic perhaps, and also that I see him as doing his own thing in a way that doesn't harm anybody and produces a good result for him. At the end of the day, it's such a nice change of pace when someone in the US is famous for growing things instead of killing people. That's my main takeaway. I think I love him because I feel like I know him. I have known people who were super charming and led marginal-looking lifestyles that they enjoyed and got something out of that wouldn't make me happy. I can't see the appeal, but it was making them happy, so you know what? Good for them. And he was just so weird that I find it riveting. From Leominster, Mass, Johnny Chapman he came. As he wandered the frontier, he earned a new name on a mission to meet thirsty settlers' needs. For we'd have no hard cider without apple seeds. Okay. Decorum. Always dignity.